Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Dr. Mark Brandon. I'm a member of the board of Princeton Adult School. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker tonight. Okay, so for tonight, not only is our lecturer, Professor Gleason, a great professor, but he's also a good selector of the music that's appropriate. We're going to be talking about paperbacks tonight. Professor Gleason is an associate professor in the Department of English at Princeton University since 2000, and he was first year in 1993 as an assistant professor right out of the graduate school, I believe. He received his PhD and his master's in English at the University of California in LA, and he had graduated for his BA in classics, summa cum laude from Amherst College. He's got a long CV, which I won't repeat, except to tell you that he specializes in 19th and 20th century American literature and culture, multi-ethnic American literatures, American social and cultural history, African American literature, American popular culture, I guess that's where the music comes from, material culture in America, work, play in American literature, architecture in American literature. He has many awards, many articles and chapters in books, and he's also the author of a book called The Leisure Ethic, Work and Play in American Literature from 1840 to 1940, published by Stanford University Press. Professor Gleason is talking tonight on the paperback revolution, the book as commodity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gleason.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Can you hear me all right if I speak at this level from here?
Yes.
Too soft? Great. And you can see what's up here?
Yeah.
All right. If this all works, we'll spend a little time on a couple of websites that I think are terrific for talking about this. And I will also have some images, so you can see those there.
Yeah.
Okay, great. You may wonder how a classicist from Amherst College ended up playing the Beatles for you in this marvelous lecture hall, which I've heard stories about, but have never actually been in. This is terrific. And I would like to thank the series for inviting me to speak, Logan Fox specifically, for making the phone call. And in fact, I feel like a bit of an imposter speaking about books as commodities when he's really the expert. Is Logan here by any chance?
He is.
Oh, good. I got into this field, and when I say field, I'm not really an historian of paperback writing, and I don't teach all my courses on the topic, but I have taught at Princeton since 1993 what was first a freshman seminar and then a lecture course in the English department called American Bestsellers. And it's a look at the history of popular writing in the United States from the earliest moment, from the moment the Puritans landed and unpacked the books they had lugged across the ocean with them, set up printing presses and started making new ones, and tracing it all the way to the present day, where in this course, I always let the students select the final book of the semester, kind of exercise in bestsellerdom, as it were. The lecture phase of this course happened to coincide with the Harry Potter phenomenon. So for 2 straight years, the final, out of 3, the final text chosen was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And so, in part, by way of preparing to lecture in the latter half of the course, I have done some research into what we call the paperback revolution, which is a period that most people understand as running from about the mid-1930s to about 1960. That is, this is the moment where paperbacks sort of emerged. You could say, were born, threw off their hardcover oppressors, and ruled the marketplace by 1960. 1960 is the first year in which the dollar value of paperbacks sold exceeds the dollar value of hardcovers. Now, hardcovers are still publishers' cash cows. That's why the Da Vinci Code is not out in paperback yet. Because as long as however many million people are buying the hardcover, the publisher will clear that much more profit. But paperbacks are a substantial, not just incremental revenue stream. I'm going to pull a bit of sleight of hand tonight because I'm going to talk about 1935 to 1960 and a little bit beyond, but I'm also going to talk quite a bit before. I hope this won't be dull to you, but I think to understand the paperback revolution as it happened in the United States in that mid-20th century, we need to learn a little bit more about the history of, in effect, cheap publishing in the US in earlier periods. So I'm going to give you really a talk in 3 phases. I'll talk first about the early history of cheap publishing up to 1930. Then I'll focus in on 1930 to 1965 and really kind of lay out a timeline, what happened almost year by year through that period, and you watch the paperbacks mature and emerge and revolt. And then I'll see what, with time permitting, talk about the present day. And since we're all living in that moment, I'd also be happy to answer questions at the end about any phase, but we could also talk more about the present if I don't end up getting there quite all the way through the formal presentation. As I say, you may wonder how a classicist ends up writing about this stuff. There were 3 factors that pushed me in this direction. One personal, one academic, and one absolute pure chance. The personal dimension is this. My father left New York in the late 1950s, early 1960s to move to Los Angeles to try to become not a paperback writer, but a television writer. And he ended up contributing scripts to TV shows like Rawhide and My Favorite Martian. And then he joined the staff as his first staff writer's job on the TV series Peyton Place, which, as you know, is based on the big 1956 bestseller by Grace Metalius about the secret scandals of a small New England town. So for several years, his job was translating that sort of paperback ethos. Actually, obviously, Metalius' book starts in hardcover, but you know what I mean, that kind of ethos onto the smaller screen. My father also had a huge paperback library. He had prominently displayed in his library the first hardcover book he could ever afford to buy, which was The King Newton. Then most of the rest of his library was paperbacks, because he was a voracious reader but could not afford the big books. In other words, in the mid to late 50s, and as he's a teenager moving into his 20s, he's one of the key markets for these cheap 25, 35, 50-cent texts that he then bought as soon as he could get his hands on them. My stepfather, not all Hollywood marriages end happily, my stepfather is a paperback writer. He's a mystery and thriller novelist. So he writes actually hardcover books, which then get reprinted in paperback. His name is Robert Crace. I don't know if any of you are fans of the Elvis Cole series. The most recent volume of that debuted on the New York Times bestseller a few weeks ago, and it just fell off. So we had a 3-week run. And a lot of what I know about the contemporary publishing industry from any kind of insider view comes from him. So any remarks I have tonight about that phase come from there. And then my mother was a book editor, so books obviously were a big deal, but certain kinds of this popular writing. All right. The academic interest started in my dissertation. I had a chapter in this project on work and play, which became my first book, on a series of best-selling novels by Edna Ferber in the 1910s about a businesswoman named Emma McChesney. Very interesting character. There are lots of male salesmen in books at the time, but this is a female saleswoman, and she bests the man at every turn. She's an incredibly talented, successful, and popular. The book sold very, very well, and popular figure. So I tried to write about that text in relation to more serious literature. I was comparing her image of an independent woman with Charlotte Perkins Gilman's image of independent women in her novel, Herland. So I was doing a kind of high-low, high culture, pop culture move. When I came to Princeton, Elaine Showalter was the chair of the English department. Did any of you know Elaine while she was here? Elaine hired me, and the summer before I came, in '93, she said, we should talk about what you want to teach next year. She said, I thought you might like to teach a freshman seminar, and in fact, I have a topic for you. I think you should teach a course called American Bestsellers. And she knew of my interests and so on. I said, that sounds great. And that's the course that became the course that I talked about earlier. And so that's the pure luck. If Elaine had not been chair, I doubt she would, another chair might not have suggested that course, and I might not have ended up having it evolve into what it is, what it became, and wouldn't be here today. So that's the long version of how this all got started. All right, let's go back and see how cheap publishing in the United States got started. As I said, the first Americans started printing as soon as they got here, virtually. 1639 is the first printing press set up in the United States, but printing as a kind of going concern is not really, it's not really a thriving industry until the late 18th century. So it takes about 160 years. Primarily because for the first 50 years at least, all the equipment had to come by boat from England. They didn't have the equipment on site, including paper. There were no paper mills in the United States until 1690. And no straw mills until 1828. So the ability to produce cheap paper doesn't even come really until the 19th century. There are some wonderful stories of ships captured in the 18th century by Spanish ships captured, and one in particular, 1748, was carrying a whole crates and crates full of papal bulls, announcements from the Pope. They were inscribed on one side and blank on the other. The Americans got hold of that paper, they flipped them over, and what we have now are popular song lyrics from the 18th century on the back of paper books. So paper was so precious, they really couldn't make it themselves. Whenever they could get their hands on it, they would use or reuse it. And in fact, it wasn't until 1762 that all 13 colonies even had their own printing plants. So it really takes a long time, over 130 years, for printing to spread itself through the colonies. In the late 18th century, what kinds of texts are people reading? What are the popular, cheap books in the late 18th century? Well, almanacs, which had been done as a very early form, were still very popular. And so here is Poor Richard's Almanac of 1733. It's the first year Franklin publishes the almanac, and the image next to it, it's a little grainy, but that's, in theory, that's Franklin to the right demonstrating a printing press. He sold 10,000 copies a year between 1733 and 1757, roughly one copy per 100 colonists at the time. So I can't do the math that quickly, but if you sold one book per 100 people today, you'd outsell Dan Brown. Spelling books were also very popular between 1783 and 1843. For that 60-year period, Noah Webster sold 24 million copies of the American Spelling. This is not entirely because Americans did not know how to spell. This is partly because American spelling, as many cultural elements of American society did after the Revolutionary War, they declared their independence from England. So spelling is revolutionized. It's Americanized in the late 18th century, early 19th century. It's when we dropped the U from many words and the American spelling. So Webster's book is actually a kind of national declaration of orthographic independence. And thus, so, I mean, 24 million copies in 60 years with a population not even approaching 20 million. All right. Another popular genre in the early 19th century are religious tracts. There are tract societies that would print cheap tracts on cheap paper, bound not in paper. We're still not technically at the era of the paperback volume, but bound in light cardboard or light hardboard, and then distributed or sold very cheaply. Here, for example, is an early 19th century bound edition of the Lord's Prayer. Another popular genre, and I don't believe I have an image of it, are chapbooks. Now, chapbooks come the closest to the paperback books that we think of when you probably think of the paperback revolution. They were compact adaptations of stories and of legends, which you could either get in a bookstore if you lived in a city, or you could get from a peddler if you lived out in the country. Or if you were lucky and you lived in Philadelphia or one of the other major urban centers, you could borrow a book from a lending library. Franklin was also a motive for the lending library, which, though initiated in the 18th century, don't really take off until the 19th century. These are the ways, different places in which you could get such cheap books. The most popular chapbooks in the late 18th and early 19th century came primarily from two genres: the criminal confession and the captivity narrative. One thing these genres shared is gore. The criminal confession, of course, says, I did it, and here's how I did it. It's a genre that has not waned in popularity. The captivity narrative has waned, at least as a literal form. Here is a Here's an illustration, well, and its waning has nothing to do with this illustration, but this is an illustration from the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson, you may have heard of. It's one of the most famous literary examples of this genre. Many, well, probably not as many as legend would have it, but some whites were captured from their homes during Indian raids on rural villages and abducted into Indian society. One of the problems with this woodcut is it's dressed the Native Americans in Anglo garb. So the power of representation is not quite that striking. I wish I could show you, and I apologize, I was saying just before we started that I haven't actually lectured on this topic in a couple of years because as Director of Graduate Studies, I've done less undergraduate teaching. And in that course, I've got racks of slides, including slides of later iterations of the captivity narrative illustration. And I don't have them all digitized, so I can't show them to you. But if you would imagine this in color, with lurid face paint and aboriginal garb and striking and stricken poses of violence, you have some idea of where the genre goes in the 19th century. And as I say, it's one of the earliest popular genres and stays one of the most popular through the 19th century. The narratives typically, as many popular formulas continue to do, offer a threat that is eventually overcome. But these narratives usually end with a person escaping and usually turning the tables on his or her captives. In the real world of the 18th century and early 19th century, again, I don't know if the right word is many or some, but some captives decided to stay within the native culture. But that's not the story that the chapbooks tend to tell. The important changes in the 19th century then, for the most part, have little to do with genre. They have little to do with topic. The more lurid, the better. The more violent, the better. In terms of cheaply available material, the real changes are technological and distributional, if that's the word, transportational. The canal networks first, and then the railroad networks later, are crucial for the distribution of cheap newspapers. And that, I think I have a slide. No, I don't. Whoops. Sorry. You're not supposed to see that yet. Cheap newspapers flourish in the early 19th century, also known as story papers, penny dreadfuls. Okay, that's my cue actually to go to the website. There's a marvelous website at Stanford. And pardon me, I'm going to access it. I have a link to it on the site for the course I'm currently teaching on late 19th, early 20th century American lit. Stanford has a marvelous website on dime novels and penny dreadfuls, which includes let's just get this bigger. Includes lots and lots of covers. And so what I'm starting to describe to you and will show in a moment are these kinds of, the penny press, basically, that emerges in the 19th century. And this is important because it is a forerunner of what eventually becomes, in the later 19th century, the dime novel. And I'll talk about each of these phases, but penny press, dime novel, pulp novels, and then the paperbacks as we know. So the cheap newspapers of the penny press brought a new hyperbolic emotionalism to the print medium. And that's a quotation, although I don't have it sourced here. And they ran, as the chapbooks did, to the sensational rather than the newsworthy. The trick was they were delivered in the form of a newspaper. And so you got, in effect, this kind of fiction along with your news. And the spread of the canal system, the railroad system, and the ever lowering costs of printing these things, so lower printing, lower distribution costs, make them very widely available, even more so than the chapbooks had been. The chapbooks are limited largely to the three venues I described earlier. You've got to buy it in a bookstore, get it at a lending library, or buy it from a peddler. These cheap newspapers, they flood basically every canal stop, every railroad stop. You can buy these things, or buy them right off the train. So the places you can buy them, and the speed with which they are turned over is much, much greater. This is also an age, I said there weren't any new genres. There are sensationalizations of the existing genres into ever more subversive forms. And a lot of literature in the mid-19th century, cheap literature, is published under the guise of self-improvement. It's literature that is intended to show you the right path by graphically illustrating the wrong path. So, books on drinking, books on self-abuse, advice for young men, advice for young women, don't do this, specifically don't do this, this, and this. They sell very well. And interestingly, a kind of collateral genre that also sells well during this time and increasingly through the 1840s and 1850s are abolitionist texts. Abolitionist texts, which also draw on these kinds of tropes of excessive violence. In this case, the violence of slave master against a slave, for example, in order to elicit sympathy among readers. Not, well, it's hard to say. There's a certain amount of titillation involved as well. They're not that distinct from the other kinds of sensationalist genres. But the ultimate goal for the abolitionists, here's what I'm trying to say. The abolitionists are drawing on the techniques of the penny press and the techniques of the chapbook to further political ends, not just profit ends. So that's an interesting sidebar to the story. Some of the other technological advances to note here, because they accelerate as the Industrial Revolution accelerates, include the replacement of the hand press, that quaint object that Franklin was standing next to, with the steam-driven flatbed press. The invention of stereotyping in 1811. This is actually a descriptive term for a technique of reproducing type. Obviously, that's where we get our word stereotype. We just do the same thing over and over and over. And then electrotyping in 1841. Electrotyping is important because it allows the creation of plates that retain the image of the text and that can be filed and reused when you want to reprint an edition. You don't have to reset the title every time. So that's a big change. And also paper. Now, mills are established, we're making our own paper, and we're making it in continuous rolls, not one sheet at a time. So the sort of mass production elements are almost entirely replaced. Books are also, in the mid-19th century, becoming themselves much more like commodities. Not just objects of reading, and not just the books I've been talking about directed to the lowest markets. You get now many, many more types and prices of books, a greater and greater stratification, including what we would call paperback, basically all paper objects, cloth books, sheepskin covered, calfskin, morocco, gilt inlaid, and that's roughly the hierarchy. And books are becoming, they always had been in a sense status objects. I mean, the folks with crates of books on the Mayflower were not the poorest folks on the ship. But in the mid-19th century, you could prove your status as a book owner by displaying a gilt-embossed edition of the same edition someone 4 doors down only has in Morocco, or only has in sheepskin, and so on. So you could distinguish yourself with the same object, but presented differently, commodified. The cheapest books at this time still cost 25 or 50 cents, which actually is out of the reach of the very poorest Americans in the mid-19th century. So when we actually talk about cheap fiction in the mid-19th century, we're talking about the lower middle, even middle class, not working class, not yet. That comes really in the 1860s. And here the Civil War is actually a very, it's almost a motive force. Combination of the changes in technology, a large mass of young men with a lot of time on their hands between battles, and some very entrepreneurial publishers. One of them you may have heard of, Erastus Beadle, who basically invents the Beadle's Dime novel, a novel sold for 10 cents, which the U.S. government bought in great numbers, and which shipped down to the soldiers. And there are stories of dime novels stacked like cordwood at Civil War encampments. It's the same, I will jump ahead just for a moment because the analogy is too good to pass up. During World War II, the U.S. published their own paperback imprint. And during a 3-year period, I think 45 to 47, published over 124 million paperback volumes for soldiers to read. So it's this kind of interesting connection. The Civil War also, after its conclusion, permits the full spread of the railroad network across the country. So once that war is done, and the nation turns to other business is when the mass market book industry can really take off. And what's interesting is that what's happening in this moment, 1860s, 70s, 80s, I described to you the stratification of book as commodity. There's now also a stratification of book as what we call it, stratification of reading audience. So now more and more books are being made, not the same book put in different covers for different people, but different books being written for completely different audiences. And it's not just books, it's also magazines. Late 19th century is an era in which magazine publishing, cheap magazine publishing, explodes. But it also stratifies. So you get very highbrow magazines, which correspond to the highbrow literary texts. Magazines like the Atlantic Monthly, Harper, some of which we still have today. They're publishing things like Mark Twain. They're publishing Henry James. They're publishing William Dean Howells. And books that often appear first serially in those magazines. It's not mine. Then are published as separate standalone volumes. There's also a middle brow tier, aimed primarily at women readers. Primarily, they are domestic or sentimental fiction. And these are, Uncle Tom's Cabin would fit into this category. There are any number of volumes, and you'll hear them described as sentimental novels, domestic novels. And their corresponding magazine is something like Godey's Ladies' Book, which is a kind of combination advice and fashion magazine, literature, advice, fashion. Stowe published in Godey's Ladies' Book. Then there's also increasingly a whole and growing low-brow genre of magazine publishing, story publishing, and they tend to be heavily illustrated, more sensational, like the kind of chapbooks I've been describing. And the best example there is something like Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And here, if we can get to, let's see, here's Frank, this will give us some images of Frank Leslie's Boys of America, for example. These are, and here we go, browse all the images. Let's see if I'll get some of these. There we go. Yeah, and you can just grab any one and they're wonderful. Frank Leslie's Boys of America, New York, May 1878, price 15 cents. Jack Harkaway and the Secret of Wealth. I'm not sure which one is Jack or what is Secret, but that's the idea. Let's see, let's just grab one more. These are too fun to pass up. Here is November 1872, it looks like. Jack Harkaway's School Days. Oh, all right, so it's the Jack Harkaway series. And that is, in fact, another feature of this lowbrow publishing. You would basically create a kind of stereotype character, a recurring character, and you just churn out more and more adventures. It would eventually feed series like Buffalo Bill, Calamity Jane. The proliferation of characters and sub-characters and sub-genres gets really kind of out of hand. What's interesting about this, and what I would emphasize, is simply that there are here very clear aesthetic choices being made by writers, publishers, and readers. And a recognition that one can increase one's profits by targeting a particular kind of audience. And a sense that, which is not entirely true, frankly, but a sense that these audiences maintain the stratification. And if you were lowbrow, you only read lowbrow, and so on. It's really not the case, and there were certainly texts that were read widely among all brows. Uncle Tom's Cabin is one example. It's really a domestic novel, but it was read by working class readers and it was read by elites in society as well. So there's more sharing going on than the stratification might suggest. But the idea is that publishers are staking out certain kinds of terrain, producing certain kinds of objects for certain kinds, with certain kinds of stories for certain kinds of people. All right. The next phase in this to jump to is the period of the pulps and the slicks. Sorry, it's one of my favorites. So this takes us back to the PowerPoint. It's the image that I showed you by accident. Famous. They're not just fantastic, they're famous fantastic mysteries. This is, I don't know if you can read this, S. Fowler Wright's compelling classic of tomorrow's destiny, The Adventure of Wyndham Smith. I imagine the large bug-like creature is window, but I can't be entirely sure. 25 cents. I don't have the year, but the pulps flourished really in the early 1900s. Although the first pulp magazine was published in 1882. It was a fiction weekly for children called The Golden Argosy by a publisher named Frank Munson. It was not very successful. I don't think the kid market was the right one for the pulps and for the possibility of the pulps. So in the 1890s, Munson retooled it as a more adult-oriented magazine, packed it with imaginative writing, called it Argosy, and to cut costs, printed it on the very cheapest paper you could buy, which was known as pulpwood. And this is where the genre gets its name. If you ever have an opportunity to go into Princeton's rare books collection and you call up any of the pulp magazines they have, and they, believe it or not, have a nice little set, because as it turns out, a graduate of the class of 3 or 4, became a pulp fiction writer. And at his death, donated all the magazines in which he had published a story. So there's actually, it's a fascinating little snapshot, because he wrote for all these different kinds of magazines. Mysteries, there were detectives like, do I have more images? Sure. There were hero magazines, here the Doc Savage, only 10 cents. And they proliferate sort of exponentially. You can see the cover illustrations are crucial. These are not heavily illustrated inside. This is where you get this is where you get color. This is where you get the most dramatic illustration. It was key to selling the volumes. These are now paper bound, and they sort of look like comic books, but it's all text inside, with maybe some line drawings at the top of a story. Some ads in the back say that might feature some illustrations, but it's not. They look like comic books. They're not. There's something between a kind of comic book and, say, a checkbook. I have more others. Come die with me. Only 10 cents. As I say, mystery, detective, fiction, the Western are the most popular genres. Sea stories were very popular, but they could really get kind of silly. In 1913, the pulp magazine Top Notch, with its cover story Tangled Battle, depicted the manly sport of automobile polo. Cleve, his right foot on the forward spring and his left hand clinging to the steel truss which protected the radiator, leaned far out to make one of his swinging drives. And I'm sorry, it's only on the slide. I can't show it to you, but it gets kind of crazy. And they do get more and more specialized, the same way that brows stratify in the 19th century. You get magazines like Railroad Stories. Every story is about something that happened on a railroad. Submarine stories, Zeppelin stories. There were magazines for every taste and on every time. All right. It's really, the pulps crest in the 20s and 30s. And in some ways they start to fade in part because this new thing called paperback, as we know it, explodes in the 1930s. And I want to shift now to phase 2 and talk a bit about what people call paperback revolution. Although you will see that phrase also gets applied to earlier periods. Some people say, oh, the first paperback revolution, those were the chapbooks, and the second paperback revolution were the dime novels, and we're in the third paperback revolution was the mid-20th century. I don't know, we must be in the fourth paperback revolution. But we'll call this the paperback revolution for the purposes of this talk. The story I'm going to tell right now is actually really kind of a timeline story. And I think it's just interesting to see the industry shift and emerge. Because you now know all the antecedents, but the actual kind of maneuvering that happens between 35 and 60 is also very interesting. Let me just check. Okay, here, this is helpful. Look at these images, and I'm going to leave the PowerPoint show in a bit and take you to another website. There's actually, there's a couple websites devoted to the paperback revolution. And one of them has some pretty cool flash animations, so I'll take you through some. All right, here, the timeline. Now, I hope the dates won't bore you, but you'll just get a sense of what's happening. I guess I'll pause every so often to emphasize a particular trend. 1935 is the date that's key because Allen Lane in London founds Penguin Liberty. The Penguin book is the one on the right. Pelican is an imprint here on the left. I'll explain where Pelican comes. It comes momentarily. But Penguin Books in London is launched with 10 titles. And they are, this is a, you can see, or can you see, Mystery and Crime. Maigret sits it out. So they were not necessarily as highbrow as Virginia Woolf, which soon appeared in under the Pelican Book series. But they were distinctive, color-coded covers. Same kind of format. So here there's a kind of publisher's imprint, right? So we go from the sort of crazy violence and color of the pulps to standardization of form. This is important. They were only 25 cents each, so they cost the same as the pulps. In some cases, just a little bit more, depending. The pulps were always fighting with each other to undercut. But they were only 25 cents, and you could not buy. You hadn't been able to buy a book for 25 cents since the 19th century. So suddenly these are very affordable. And they are an immediate success in London. We're still in London. Between 1935 and 1939, Penguin London launches 2 subsidiaries. Pelican, which is devoted to non-fiction and the classics. So that's why Woolf is in that series. And what they call Penguin Specials. And I don't have an image of that for you, but they were topics, paperback-only books, sort of rushed to print, had not been already, not existing books converted into the Penguin or Pelican series, but sort of special paperback editions. In 1939, the paperback revolution comes stateside through a company called Pocket Books. Launched by Robert de Graaf, 10 titles, just like Penguin, and I don't believe that I know, I'm sorry, I don't have an image of a Pocket book, but the website I'll take you to in a moment will. Also, did I say 10 titles? He picked 10 titles to launch. He sold them only in New York City, and he was literally an overnight success. So the London model proved within 4 years to work in the States as well. All right, let me take you to this website as I then go through some more of the chronology, because you'll see it's well worth going to if you were interested in seeing more. I apologize. I've just gotten this laptop after my other one passed away. And well, I didn't have time to make a I didn't have time to make a link to it. But if you type in paperback revolution, it couldn't be simpler. You get, aha, the paperback revolution site. You can see drawing on some of the ethos of the kind of scandal of these paperbacks. It democratized reading. It changed publishing forever. And it describes this revolution in reading. You can see I've stolen the image of the Woolf book right from their website, so there's the credit. But they have a terrific gallery that is offered to you as what they call the virtual paperback rack. So this is fun. You need flash animation to make this work, but here, you can, oh look, we've got Wild West, so there's one of those older papers, but you could pick, let's say, Weep Not, Fair Lady, and it will tell you this is written by John Evans, it's published by Harlequin in 1950. It's an early example of a paperback from Toronto's Harlequin. It's a murder mystery. In fact, as this note tells you, Harlequin is founded in 1950 in Canada and doesn't become a romance imprint, which is really what, as we know it today, until 1958. So for the first 8 years, it's just sort of competing in this open market that I'll describe to you a bit more in a moment with other paperback publishers. You can also look inside these books, although again, they're kind of like the Post. They're not graphically illustrated. They're not comic books. They're novels. And they look just like novels. It's just the covers that are really, well, there's a little bit of a splash of them. It's the covers that are pretty cool. Let's go back to the rack. Now here's the great feature. When you click on the hand, the rack spins. And then you can get a new book. You can get Young Claudia, published from Dell in 1956. Pardon? She's clipping something. For a very modern marriage with David Briggs' New Complications. Okay. I don't want to ask it even more. The deep, well, but we need to read read this. The deep love and gay, crazy life they led together are what Claudia tries to save for David. She wants him when he returns from the war to find everything just the way he left it. But Claudia and David learn that compromises must be made when two people love. So you can play with this rack on your phone. We'll get one more spin. I'll just let you see what comes up. Oh, young Claudia, they can't all right, the rest of the timeline I think I'll run through quickly because it'll just give you a sense of what happens here is basically this. Penguin is successful, Pocket is successful. There are a lot of other publishers who want a piece of this business. Many of them come from the pulp industry. The pulp publishers say, I know how to make cheap paper objects. Let me cut my magazines down to this tiny size and sell them for a quarter and make a fortune. In 1939, Penguin, realizing Pocket has scooped them in the US market, creates a US subsidiary called Penguin Books, run by a man named Ian Ballantyne. He's a graduate student at the time. 1941, Avon Books is founded. Avon goes for the cheapest market so far. You've seen that Penguin and Pocket have gone, well, these examples didn't show, but Penguin and Pocket went for slightly more highbrow titles. And the kind of uniformity of cover. Avon comes in and does something more like what you see on these racks. That is, more like the 19th century sensational stuff. More mystery, more Western, more like the pulps. They called their series, quite cleverly, the Avon Pocket Size Book Series. And were probably sued by Pocket Books for copyright infringement. 1942, we see the founding of the Popular Library. 1943, the US government launches their Armed Services editions, which did not come with weapons, but as I say, were distributed to soldiers. In 1943, George Delacorte launches Dell Books. He is a pulp publisher. He's almost a decade into it, but he brings his know-how and savvy and almost immediately becomes #2 in the US behind Pocket. So when the pulp publishers get into the business, they jump in with both feet and really begin to exert some muscle. I'll highlight a couple of the next key moments in the chronology. In 1944, Pocket Books is purchased by Marshall Field III, the distinguished Chicago department store owner. And this adds a certain amount of cultural legitimacy to the paperback industry. Notice, no hardcover publishers have jumped into paperbacks yet. This is all a completely separate industry trying to sell books cheap. But the hardcover publishers want nothing to do with it because they're cheap. They don't want to cheapen their product. Marshall Field buys Pocket Books and brings a certain amount of legitimization. I am happy to associate myself in this way, this is from the press release, with a group of publishers who have pioneered in democratizing the creation and distribution of good books in America. Field was also very savvy, and there are cash register sounds that should be going on this too. All of them believe in making good books conveniently and widely available by exacting editorial and production standards. No slipshod work here. Intensive promotion and bold experiments in developing new outlets. 1945, Ballantyne leaves Penguin, right? So he's running a subsidiary of Penguin and launches Bantam Books. Still exists today. And in 1948, Penguin finally decides to sell the US subsidiary to US publishers. And they leave the US market to Americans. And what does Penguin London do? They recede, or migrate, the verb doesn't make a difference here, into classics and college publishing. The Penguin books that, if you had them when you were in school or your children do, that sort of ubiquitous, the Penguin edition you've got of that Hawthorne or Melville or Thoreau, whatever it is. That happens when Penguin decides, all right, we can't compete any longer in the US market, we'll move into the college market and then re-infiltrate that way, and that's what happened. In 1949, the first hardcover publisher decides to take a crack at this market, and it's Doubleday. And they don't jump in with both feet, they jump in with one foot, and they create this kind of oddball hybrid called the perma-book. I wish I had one to show you. It's a hybrid, and I've never handled one, so I only know this from descriptive language. It's a hybrid hardcover / paperback. I don't really know what that means. Isn't that what a hardcover book is? But somehow they thought, we'll do something that's a little more distinguished than paperback. We'll do the permabook. And you can tell they're aiming for, this will last. This is not ephemeral. This actually ends up further helping legitimize the industry. If Doubleday is interested, this can't just be cheap. And eventually, in a few years, Doubleday retires the permabook's vehicle and introduces their own paperback imprint, which is Anchor Books. That's Doubleday's paperback line. All right, in 1950 then, that's roughly where we are. Pocket is still number 1 with 50 million units sold a year. Bantam is number 2 with 38. And the New American Library is number 3 with about 30 million. So among the 3 top sellers alone, there are well over 100 million copies of paperback books being sold by 1950 in the US. And these are only the 3 main publishers. There are at least a half dozen other competitors selling perhaps in the 10 range at least. All right. The story of the rest of the 1950s I won't give to you in detail, but it's additional imprints. Ballantine jumps ship once again and moves from Bantam to found Ballantine Books. Finally gets to name one after himself. And Ballantine is significant because it's the first publisher to publish hardcover and paperback editions, same volume, simultaneously. So Doubleday is doing paperback, separate imprint from their hardcover. But Ballantine will print a hardcover edition and a paperback edition. So you can start to make choices, but from the same publisher, the same text. And finally, 1960, US dollar sales of paperbacks surpassed hardcover sales for the first time, and the revolution, at least in one sense, is complete. I wanted to end, and I think I've got a few more minutes, if you'll indulge me, by gesturing towards some of the directions paperback or paper-bound publishing has taken today. And I'll just mention 3. And I actually forget, let's see. Okay, they started this way. One of those is the superhero genre, right, which is in effect a more thick book-bound comic book, and something more like what we would call a graphic novel, although I'm going to say that for a separate category. So I think it's a different kind of document than the hero comics, but which are nonetheless published. You can buy these in book form today. So I'm jumping from 1960 up to what you could find if you walk into a bookstore today. That in effect is the next, if we want to call it, 4th phase of paperback publishing. So here, for example, the Spider-Man paper book. Then there's also the manga books. These are Japanese books. They are related to, but not quite the same thing as the animation, the movies. But it's a distinctively Japanese aesthetic style. They are often, they often look like they are kids' books. But as you can see, this volume says explicitly for mature audiences, ages 16 plus. And it's very interesting. I actually found, as I was doing a bit of research, a website in which I guess it's a bookseller counseling book buyers and librarians on how to negotiate this new terrain of the manga text. How do you know what to buy for kids? And one of the big points that the person makes is don't assume that if there's a cuddly picture on the front, that it's necessarily suitable for young children. And even the books that are marketed to young children in Japan include far more mature themes, critics have found, than a typical kid's book in the United States. And it's just, so there are cultural differences at work here. But this is another phase of contemporary paperback publishing that's really new in some ways. And then the last phase is what I think we should call the graphic novel. Many of you may be familiar with Art Spiegelman's Mouse. This is in effect a paperback, thick paperback, but heavy paper, not cheap paper. Thick paper, bound book, not hardcover, it's paper, but it's a comic. And I've just got, for those who haven't seen it, one frame from inside the book, one page from inside the book. He retells the story of the Holocaust through mouse figures. obviously an unusual, like innovative kind of aesthetic choice, political choice, but here it's the comic book form tackling serious issues. And being read by adult readers, being read by them all. Speaking of the most recent book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, In the Shadow of No Towers, about the World Trade Center. Itself a very tall, almost skyscraper-like volume. And then you may have been hearing, oh, sorry, this is, I forgot I put this on here. This is reputed to be the very first graphic novel. A Contract with God and the Tenement Stories put out by DC Comics. And this is, if I'm not certain I have my date right, this is, I believe, the early 70s, but I may be mistaken. But the most recent graphic novels you may be hearing about, a graphic novel you may be hearing about is Sin City by Frank Miller. The movie that's just been released, those of you who may know, the film director has adapted the literal look of these extremely graphic and violent cartoon novels to the screen with sort of black and white splashes of dramatic color. So this is another new direction for paperback publishing. The graphic novel can be an incredibly artistic form, as you saw with Mouse. I wanted to show you here Frank Miller, the author of Sin City, was also the lead writer for The Dark Knight Returns, which is often held as a landmark in the history of the graphic novel, because it took the comic book character, Batman, brought him back into, in effect, a more adult format, and examined his kind of darker side. So The Dark Knight Returns, and here's a full color page, and you can see the sort of the disruption of space, spatial reconfiguration of the page of the novel, and the intermingling of text and image. But that's where he began, and now Sin City is his latest series. There's no end to the way such things can be commodified and commercialized. So I was delighted to find that there actually is an idiot's guide to this graphic novel. I suppose that's the ultimate sign that the form has made its way. Once there's an idiot's guide to it. And I think, yeah, there's no topping that. So that's where I'll end. Thank you very much. No hard questions, but I'll yes.
Why do you think in 1935 it took off? I mean, you mentioned that the economics were lower. It was a lower price book. It was a smaller book, and I guess maybe they could tap different writing, lower cost writers.
Not necessarily the lower cost writers, that is, because you saw Woolf. Virginia Woolf is someone they put in their series. It's actually, it's a combination of factors, and I'm not, to be frank, I haven't read a good explanation of sort of, oh, of course this had to happen right at this moment, but it's a combination of the pulp industry proved that you could publish these objects cheaply, get people to buy them repeatedly, and in effect, the paperback publishers like Penguin and like Pocket thought, let's just try this. Let's take the same techniques with slightly better paper and a much smaller size. And this is actually one of the keys, because the smaller size means it's much less expensive to print. The marketing of the Pocket book as a pocket book, which, I'm sorry, I didn't bring one, but they're about this size, even a little bit skinnier. The conceit is that you can fit it in your pocket. But in fact, it's a money-saving printing technique. Smaller fonts, smaller pages. So in some sense, what's right about 1935 is the pulp industry has become so well established and is making so much money collectively that bigger publishing interests, where people with grander schemes think, could I tap a slightly, at first, higher level by using the same kinds of techniques and selling for this lower price? I don't know if that answers your question, but it's something about the success of the pulps, and I I guess, the lingering stratification of readership that begins in the late 19th century. This idea that there is an upper market and a middle market and a lower market. So what if we could take the lower marketing principles and sell them to the upper market? Wouldn't there be a consistent market from that? Yes?
Is there an active collector's market on the 1900s to 1930s area?
For pulp magazines, absolutely.
Yes.
It's extraordinary.
How would one find that?
eBay. eBay. Or if you go onto Google and type in pulp covers.
But if you want to sell them.
Oh, I see. So you have some you'd like to
Yes,
sell?
yes.
Ah.
You want to talk later?
I still think eBay is probably the answer. But there are a number of, well, I guess this is not eBay. There are a number of independent collectors who have been amassing these over the years and then have begun to publish books of the cover art. There are some marvelous books on pulp art and studies of the artists. Scoring a cover by a particularly important artist could actually increase the circulation of your pulp in a given week. So there's a very, very active sales and collectible market.
Thank you.
Yes?
There were two kinds of edition available in 1935 that you haven't mentioned, and I guess because they had no influence on all this. One is the Modern Library, and the other is the Tauschnitz.
Do you want to say a bit more about either of those?
Well, the Tauschnitz edition was a paperback, which a lot of people had found, but you didn't have to buy it. And the Modern Library was also small, like the paperback that you mentioned, but it was a hardcover.
Right, thank you. No, I'm glad you did mention those. And in fact, by mentioning them, you remind me that one of the other, this is partly an answer again to your question, one of the other new decisions Pocket and Penguin made was to bind their books with glue and not thread. So just the right cheap glue, and you know what these paperbacks do after 3 readings. The right cheap glue would also save the publisher a tremendous amount of money. But yes, those are two other, and this website on the Paperback Revolution maps that out as well. So if you want to tell the full story here, you can just know about the Tauschnitz and the Modern Library. So basically different phases of the migration from hardcover books and other kinds of paper reading objects to, hey, why not paper books? Yes?
Wouldn't authors have an interest in being printed in hardcover because they would make more money? I mean, why would a Virginia Woolf come out in paperback initially?
That's a good question. She wouldn't necessarily come out initially. And I would actually need to do more research on the authorial economics here. For the most part, these writers are still publishing in hardcover and are still making their principal royalties off hardcover. But my guess is I don't know the full story here, but my guess is that when Penguin first decided to select these 10 titles, that he wanted to be slightly higher rather than lower brow. He went to certain contacts to see if he could entice them into what he would pitch as a kind of distinguished series,
So
but I'm not quite sure how the royalties would have worked.
They were reprints in effect?
The initial Penguin series were, yes. Yeah, it's not until I'm sorry, my apologies. I mentioned this earlier, but I'm just not seeing my note here. It's not for a couple of years until a press starts. Oh no, sorry, it's the Penguin Specials, right? Penguin creates its own category of books that were sort of straight to paper, as it were. Yes.
Would you venture a comment on ebooks and their future?
Sure. That's it. And I should ask, are you all hearing the questions okay? Should I be repeating them? ebooks. When I first taught this course, or not this course, when I first taught the course on bestsellers, as a lecture course, ebooks were available for the first time. And so I asked my students to speculate on this, exactly on this technology's future. And the results were interesting because many of them said, well, you know, it depends on a number of things. It depends on how inexpensive they are. It depends on ultimately how easy the technology is. But most of them said, no matter how good those factors may be, they felt, so these are college students, let's say 6 years ago, that there's nothing to replace the feel of holding a book in your hand. And that until perhaps they come out with an ebook reader that is actually, let's say, like a paperback, that you open and the text moves on the page, they really haven't taken off in the way that people had predicted when they first became available, which is not to say they haven't grown. And I think it was Stephen King who went on a deal with Amazon, right, where you could download chapters of his ebook, and I think that was the biggest bump in ebook usage during this phase. But I would say it hasn't quite become, it certainly hasn't replaced, even in a small way, books, in the same way that each new technology, the prediction is that it will replace the old, it will outmode the old completely. And with reading, that's often, the book itself is a very persistent form. And that's another thing that this sort of story tells. So in effect, the paperbacks we have today are not that different from the almanacs that Franklin was printing in terms of the idea and the process. And the object is not that different. So it's a rather stubborn form. That is the portable, readable object. Yes?
Can you discuss at what point it becomes, there's no stigma attached to writing for cheaper venues when, a distinguished writer doesn't care whether or not her work comes out of paper?
You mean after the hardcover?
Yeah, but even now, there doesn't seem to be much distinction. It seems more in the genre, the distinctions in the genre now, not in the physical format of the book.
Right. I mean, there's still a kind of hardcover paperback hierarchy, cultural hierarchy, and it's still, for the most part, a 1-2 punch for publishers. So, typically for fiction, that is, hardcover first, paperback to follow. Typically in years' time, but not always. And often, authors can elect to have books published hard and paper simultaneously, or they can elect to go straight to paper. The more established ones, as you say, don't have to worry. It's the publishers who tend to make their greatest profits, this is as I understand, off the hardcover. But the writers really start to make their royalties off the paper because of the volume of sales. And that's often, I think it's just the way, and if I have this wrong, please let me know, but this is what I sort of buy from my stepfather. You want the hardcover to hit the bestseller list so that the paperback will sell big time when you re-release the paperback a year later or however soon, and it says New York Times bestseller list. So the fact that a hardcover book does well becomes a marketing tool for the paperback, and that's where the author might really make sustaining money in most cases. If I took that, if I understood your question.
Right, but
There's certainly less stigma today, I would say, in publishing paper. And we're also seeing, I think this is what the graphic novel genre is doing somewhat. We're seeing original writing being published in a paper form, and in a comic form, in an illustrated form. Clearly highbrow, clearly serious literature, but it's not that hardbound text.
But the stigma was there up until the 80s.
Yeah, well, the stigma, if you go all the way back, the stigma about reading fiction is there from the 17th century. So you first have to get away from the stigma about fiction reading. And then you have to get away from the stigma of cheap fiction reading. And that still exists. So, for example, you get away from the stigma of fiction reading, for the most part, not completely, but by the mid-19th century. But in the late 19th century, the stigma of cheap fiction reading has now replaced it. There's a great quote, and I don't have it down here, so I can't give it to you in full, but Henry James, who had a a desperate desire to be popular, but not to pander to the popular market. Lamented the presence, and I don't remember the right phrase, but the presence of all these cheap books in sort of gas-lit railroad shop stalls. Just this the whole image of the grimy, greasy, and the irony is he really wished that his books were there, or that they were being read more widely than they were, because they weren't read nearly as widely as many of the historical novelists of the 1890s who we don't remember today, or the sentimental novelists, or the romantic novelists. So that's the next hurdle to get over. And now I would say, I know when people I know publish their first book, they would like it to be in hardcover, but sometimes they can't do it. And there certainly is, I would say, less stigma to it. There's even a whole new category now called the paperback original. You've heard of this category? When my stepfather published his first Elvis Cole novel called The Monkey's Raincoat, he was not an established writer. He had written short fiction. He had written for television, but he never published a novel. So no hardcover publisher was going to publish a brand new novel by this writer, largely unknown, in hardcover. So his first book came out as a paperback original. And this is such an established genre, actually, for basically first books by unknown writers, particularly within the mystery field, that they have a whole awards category every year among mystery writers for best paperback original. It's just recognized as some people can only get into that genre. Luckily, that book for him sold well, and all the rest of his books have been hardcover, and then they come out later in paperback. But there are even categories where it's understood that's your first. And obviously he was thrilled to have that, so no stigma attached to it in that sense. Yes.
Could you comment a little on the fact that there now seems to be a whole hierarchy of paperbacks. There isn't just paperbacks and hardcovers. So.
I'm sorry. I laughed. I probably need a third computer. Hang on 1 second. I'm going to put this to sleep. I spit up as you said that. When I actually I went to pull off my shelves artifacts. I thought, I'm going to bring paperbacks and I'm going to hold them up as I talk about them. And I thought, no, this is silly. I have images. I won't do that. But I had managed to pull off in about 2 minutes' time at least 7 different sizes of paperback, ranging from the mass market, right, which you know as the smallest one, up to the trade size paperback, the larger, more distinguished paperback. But as I was doing it, I thought, yeah, I'll find mass market and trade. But I found multiple levels of trade, and they seemed to get a little taller the more distinguished the author was. The Don DeLillo novel I pulled off my shelf was taller than the Penguin trade edition of Hawthorne's stories. So I guess they're not necessarily he's not necessarily more distinctive than Hawthorne, but somehow DeLillo's book needed to be higher. Then I also found a couple of books that I had from the 60s that are the mass market text, but they're actually a tiny bit skinnier and a tiny bit taller than the mass market books we have today. So you can stack these things up. They have sort of uniform ranges, but not uniform sizes. For the most part, though, it's mass market, the stuff you see in a rack at Eckerd's or a supermarket, and also obviously in bookstores. And then the trade paperbacks, which are, in theory, the slightly better quality vintage series, good fiction as opposed to the cheaper fiction. And then obviously use some price differences too. Was there more behind your question about the size?
No, I've seen even sort of expensive art books in paperback and art, and sort of going down from there.
Yes. Yes, he said there are of course now even expensive art books in paper. So yeah, I mean paper really virtually the whole range of publishing and pricing options are comfortably suited in paper, where for such a long time it was in effect an inferior genre. Yes?
Is there a difference in royalties for an author between hardcover and paperback?
Well, here it really all depends what you negotiate with your publisher and what kind of leverage you have. I know primarily what my stepfather's situation is, and the royalties do differ from hardcover to paperback. they're not necessarily, I forget exactly how this works, they're not necessarily smaller for paperback, but because the volume of sales is so much greater. I think they are smaller for paperback. Your royalty is bigger for hardcover, smaller for paperback. In fact, that was the same for my book, so now I remember. So each hardcover copy my mother bought would bring me $1, and each paper version that the library bought and then bound might bring me 50 cents, but because more libraries bought them than my mother. So yeah, you do, but it's all about negotiation from an author's. Yes.
But there's some things that happen in reverse, like an author who wrote paperbacks, like Charles Dickens maybe wrote those little stories on paper, and then he became a great classic art. So it went in reverse.
Yeah, well, we would think of it as reverse today, but for that, in the 19th century, it was actually quite normal to publish serially first and publish in journals, or sometimes in newspapers, or the version of mid-19th century magazines, and then have the edition brought out in hardcover. And it wasn't that you hadn't made it, now you had made it. It was simply that was the common form. And Dickens is famous for writing to the serial form, so you get cliffhangers with each installment. In fact, and that's one of the most interesting ways of reading Dickens today in a paperback or hardcover edition, is trying to figure out where did the serial break the story, because you usually can't tell. Uncle Tom's Cabin was serialized in an abolitionist newspaper before it was published as a hardcover. Actually, this is an interesting story. It's the National Era, and Stowe claims that she did not know how the book would end when she began writing it and publishing it. It becomes such a phenomenon. This small circulation abolitionist newspaper is suddenly selling like hotcakes because Stowe's novel is taking off in serial form, that her publisher rushes it into print, hardcover edition, before the last installment of the serial appears. So if you had the means, you could buy the hardcover edition and get the ending before the subscribers of the National Era, just because it was a serial publication. That's how the success of that actually ran away with itself. And so the hardcover emerged before the series was done. But for examples of the reverse today, I guess someone like my stepfather is an example, who begins in the paper genre and then establishes a reputation and can be brought into hardcover. But there are certainly writers who make that move and then fall back out of the hardcover realm. It's if you've ever heard of the curse of the mid-list writer, someone who doesn't make the Times top 15 and who isn't at the very bottom, but is somewhere in the middle and doesn't quite sell enough books consistently for the publisher or the author to make a decent profit off the hardcover, and eventually they won't ask you to sign a new contract for a new hardcover, so you may need to find other venues. So there's a certain, I guess that's a reverse of fortune more than the kind of reverse you were asking about. Yes?
I read that hardcover sales have slowed down in America.
By all measures, reading has declined in America.
I was wondering if the softcover has gone a lockstep with the hardcover.
Well, it depends what measures you use. By dollar volume, things are fine, but that's because books cost more than they used to. By most measures, by most reading measures, how many people are buying books, how many units are sold, how many are returned, how many people are actually potentially reading, we think that it's less hardcover and paperback. There are also always dire proclamations about the decline of reading, the decline of culture. I don't know that I'm instantly ready to condemn us as on our way to becoming an illiterate or more illiterate society. But, considered on the whole, books are still a strong market. There are certain sectors that are doing well, and there are certain others that are not doing as well. If you look at the New York Times bestseller list, hardcover or paperback, you'll see the same kinds of genres and often the same kinds of writers. Certain sectors that have gained include children's books. So the Harry Potter phenomenon is real and has had a spillover effect. You may or not be aware, in 2000, when Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the fourth book in the series, was about to come out, and would have put J.K. Rowling with the top 4 slots on the New York Times bestseller list at that moment. The Times Book Review decided to create an entirely new list called Best-Selling Children's Books, and migrated all those titles over to that. Partly, I think in response to complaints by publishers and authors that her books had become so successful it was keeping 3 or 4 writers a week off that list. I mean, you laugh, that sounds silly, but that's potentially 3 or 4 careers not. And it's potentially millions of dollars not brought to a publisher. So the leverage the publishers brought to bear on the New York Times, which has always, by the way, sorry to slide over from paperback into bestsellers, but the New York Times has always been the list about which publishers and writers have been most suspicious. The New York Times does not disclose its formula for creating its list. It acknowledges that they use information provided by booksellers. They acknowledge that they offer that they use a weighted formula, but they don't disclose what weights what. The New York Times was actually sued once by William Peter Blatty, who was convinced, based on information he had from his publisher, that the New York Times was underreporting sales of his novels. And I don't know that if this is just author paranoia or publisher paranoia, but the fact that they don't disclose their method is suspicious. The USA Today list publishes its bestsellers based entirely on sales figures, so in a sense that's an honest list. Publishers Weekly does the same thing. The New York Times still is the list with the most sway, though. And the #1 New York Times bestseller is the best thing any author can ever do.
You know, I'm a voracious reader, but the libraries are so much better and more popular. Fiction is available so much nicer and beautiful. I haven't bought a book in months. And how does that figure in with the bestseller list? There's no best reader list, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, again, there is a certain marked decline in book buying and possibly book reading.
Is it because libraries are so much better? I mean, our Princeton Public Library is fabulous. It's better than a bookstore.
I think that's part of it. I also think, I mean, how many of you go to Barnes & Noble, the Superstore down on Route 1, or the Borders down on Route 1? They tend to be packed, but not everyone there is buying the book. People are doing other things. Sure, it's a social place. Obviously, you can buy food and coffee there, and you can use it like a library. And I see many people, and I won't tell you I haven't done it myself, consulting documents on their shelves that I ultimately decided not to purchase. I think some of it is better libraries, but I don't know that we actually have good statistics, and Princeton's probably an anomaly, that libraries themselves have multiplied the way.
Because that library is like a little Barnes & Nobles. They have a seating area, I mean, the coffee shop, I mean.
Well, see, the chain explosion is a whole other story. I don't know if you remember the old Market Fair Mall, where there was the little Walden Books. That used to be, the mall bookstore was this little narrow thing, before it became an anchor. And how many of you remember that anchor used to be Stearns, the department store? So now that's the bookstore, or book mega store. What we have seen, what we know the chains have done, whether they've increased reading or not, data may differ. That is, people tend to be buying more from the chains, but overall reading is going down. What we have seen is the loss of many, many independent bookstores. We are very lucky to have an independent bookstore that is not only successful, but bought the space next to it so that it could expand. At the very same moment, Barnes & Noble and Borders came to Princeton, effectively. So that's a testament to, I think, the people who like to read in this town. But that's, if you want to chart, if you want graphs, the number of independent bookstores and sales of independent bookstores has plummeted, as the reverse has been true for chains. So that's a sad story. Yes?
We're going to have to let you go, but I still want to ask another question. I listen to books all the time. What is that? Isn't that from when I started listening, that's just exploded.
Yeah, I don't know what percentage of the market it drives, but it is certainly has grabbed an increased share, and they are usually done. It's usually a tie-in and part of your book deal. When you sign a book deal, it's for the hardcover, and then the paperback, and then the audio version. So they're now part of the package deal, and they have become very popular. And particularly with the advent of CDs, you can have, They're much smaller, literally, to carry around than those stacks of cassettes that you used to have to get out. I don't know. I don't know if the sales of books or renting or borrowing books on tape or CD changed after 9/11 when there was supposedly less driving going and less travel going on. But now that that has swung back up, I imagine you'd see an uptick again in listening to books. Yes.
I'd always thought that there was no market for soft cover books by public libraries or school libraries, but something you said earlier makes me question that. You mentioned that libraries will buy soft cover books and rebind them?
Sometimes, or they buy the library binding edition. But publishers charge much more for the already bound library edition. And it's my understanding that libraries can buy paperback editions and then you send them out, or you have your own binding staff. I think the Princeton University Library has its own book binding staff.
And it's cheaper for them to do that.
That's what I understand. I may be mistaken. That's not a corner I've investigated deeply. You'll see notations if you have borrowing privileges at the Princeton University Library. You'll see that books are in process when they arrive, and they're not just cataloging them. They're actually, in some cases, preparing. They'll do the same. I mean, it's similar. They'll do the same with journals that arrive in paper. When the year is up, you take the 4 journals, send them to be bound, or you bind it. But I know that it's also done by paperback.
Is your understanding that the longevity of the books would be pretty much equal then? The original hardcover versus?
Pretty much, yeah. But much cheaper for a library to buy the paper edition of my book, say, than the hardcover edition. And I mean, this is a whole other topic, and obviously related, but it's slightly different. I'm on the committee for library and computing at the university, and one of the topics, one of the changes I've become aware of is library budgets for acquisition have shifted so massively away from new books to new serials, that is, new journals. Because that's where much work in academic fields has moved, that it's actually almost having a reverberating crisis, because Princeton's not the only place, Princeton's only one of many, among academic publishers. It has become much harder for, say, an assistant professor to get a book published by an academic publisher because the end market has changed. Libraries simply are not buying as many copies of new books. They are in some cases buying electronic rights to books. So when Stanford did my book, a year later, they wrote me back and asked if they could also buy the electronic rights, and then the electronic rights. So I said yes, because again, my mother doesn't buy enough of the hard rights. So that will change academic scholarship, certainly, it already has. But the journals cost a lot of money to purchase the rights to them, especially electronic access. And you may or may not know some of the most popular journals, most important journals, are also controlled by publishing conglomerates who charge millions of dollars for Princeton to buy the rights for faculty to have access to journals like SED, right, for biology. So it's, when you talk about how knowledge gets between covers and moves around, there are actually a lot of different ways this reverberates. So thanks for asking.